We're in Isaiah chapter 9 this morning. Got to tie my shoe or I'm going to trip on it, guys. It would be, yes. And we're actually going to start at the bottom of chapter 8 this morning. We've seen in Isaiah chapter, going even back to Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3, we saw Isaiah's first son be born, and his name is Shear-Jashub. Shear-Jashub. And that name literally means a remnant will return. You go back into Isaiah chapter 6, the very last verse, and we see, yet in it shall a tenth. And so we've already, that idea of a remnant has already been alluded to in Isaiah in chapter 6 and chapter 7. As we move into through chapter 8, we've seen Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, and we spent the last couple of weeks looking at a lot of maps and a history, and we saw that Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, the idea is that before he can even say mama and daddy, two kings are going to be wiped out, the Syrian king and the Israel king. And so you don't need to worry about that, Isaiah says. And as we move through the rest of chapter 8, as you get down to verse number 20, he says there at the end of verse 20, there is no light in them. What happens to a society when they lose sight of who God is? And so Isaiah, and that's what's happening in Israel, that's what's happening in Judah, and as we've gone through Old Testament history, and we go through these prophets, this awful stuff is going to happen to the northern kingdom, and it's there partly so that the southern kingdom can learn from the mistakes of their brothers up north, but they're not going to learn anything. And so Israel by this time, and Judah's going to get there very quickly, is a society where there is no light in it. And they will pass through, verse 21, they will be hungry, and it shall come to pass when they shall be hungry, that they shall fret themselves and curse their king and their God, and they'll look upward, and they'll look back into the earth, and behold trouble and darkness, dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. One of the interesting things about the book of Isaiah is, as we've talked about, there is some bad stuff happening in Isaiah, but then there is a light, if you will, at the end of the tunnel. And so as we close out chapter 8, there is no light in that society. There is darkness. There is hunger. There are people who are hating their leaders. And then you jump down into verse number 9, or chapter 9, and there is going to be a dawn of a new day. And I want us particularly look, and you look at verse 1, you've got Zebulun and Naphtali and some the Jordan, and it's talking about in Galilee of the nations. And so it's talking about up north in those northern tribes. And then you go and look at verse 2. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light, that they dwell in the land of the shadow of death. Upon them hath the light shined. Thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For they have broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, in the day of Midian. I want to go back up to verse number 2. They are in the land of the shadow of death. Upon them has the light shined. What does that remind you of? Okay, 23rd Psalm, Mike says, I want you to move forward. Okay, there's a prophecy about Jesus coming. Now, we're going to see, it becomes very obvious in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. Okay, that's the song we just sang. But when you say the Messiah, what about these verses right here remind you about Jesus? Sherry, you said it first. Ma'am? Okay, John, keep your finger here and go to John chapter 1. That's the answer, John chapter 1. Now, we're going to keep your finger in Isaiah. We'll be right back there in just a second. But John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was the life, and the life, His life was what? The light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. When Jesus came into the world, when Jesus came into Bethlehem and then grew up in Nazareth, that part of the world was controlled by who? The Romans. And they controlled everything. We have it so good in our country where we're not indebted to anybody other than, I guess, our own government, okay? But it's our own government. It's not somebody else's government. And you can imagine having to pay taxes to our worst enemy. That's what they were having to do. And so when Jesus came, God's people, God's children had been over 300 and maybe as many as 450 years without any word from God. It was dark times, but it was into that time that Jesus, the light, came. Now back up in your Bibles, and he goes on, and for the next several verses, you start in verse 7, it talks about, I'm in John still, it talks about that light that's coming, that true light, and that light was Jesus Christ. Now back up to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4. Here's where you got to be real careful. Looking at unsound, let me say it like that, commentators. Because there will be commentators that would tell you that these verses right here that we're talking about in Isaiah have nothing to do with Christ. And why do they want you to think, why do they want you to think that these passages in the Old Testament have nothing to do with Christ and His kingdom coming?
They want a future king. They want something about the reign and all that.
The world wants a future physical king who is going to reign in a physical kingdom in this world. That's not much different than what the disciples were looking for. They wanted somebody to come in and kick Rome out and set up Israel as the big dog in the world. But that's not what this is talking about. Jesus came to set up what kind of kingdom? A spirit, not a physical king. The disciples never got that during his life. But look, and so you might read a commentator that would say, this is not messianic. But what is the best commentary of the Bible? Well, let's go to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse number 12. Now, when Jesus had heard that John was delivered into prison, he departed up into Galilee. He went up north. Go back to Isaiah 9. Where was it talking about? Galilee, the north, up there in the north. Galilee was where Naphtali and Ephraim and all those tribes were. Let's keep reading. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Nephthalim. Verse number 14. That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of, this is Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. The land of Zebulun and the land of Nephthalim, by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light. And to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. As bad as it was for the Jews in Jerusalem, it was likely even worse for the Jews up in Galilee. And so we go back to Isaiah chapter 9, and you've got those first few verses are fulfilled directly, according to the inspired writer Matthew, by Jesus when he went up into Galilee from Nazareth. Then let's jump down to verse number 6 and 7. Okay, we talked about there's a light coming. Go, Jeff.
Real quick, you have to also remember this is a prophecy for the Gentiles, which are us. This is not just for the Jews, and this is what they should have known. Though Christ was coming for all people, but yet they said over and over they had this sinful idea instead of everybody coming in. Because this is who it's talking about. This is talking about us.
That's right. And let's thank you for bringing that out. Christ didn't just come for the Jews. He came for the Jews, yes he did, and he was going to go to them first. But the bigger picture was that he came for the Gentiles. And Jeff puts it in a real much, he came for us. They're likely, if there's a Jew in the room, that's fine. But likely sitting in this room right now, there's nobody here that's got, we're all Gentiles. And so that's who Christ came for the Jew and the Gentile. And what the world doesn't want to see is that throughout these Old Testament prophecies, here it's not just a hint, it's a shout that Christ came for the Gentiles. Now, let me ask you, did the Jews understand that? Go back to Isaiah chapter 6. What did God tell Isaiah? You're going to prophesy, you're going to teach, and they're going to hear you, but they are not going to understand what you say. You're going to do things, and they're not going to listen, they're not going to want to hear, they're not going to want to put it in their heart. And so they didn't understand that, but when you get to the New Testament, and the New Testament says, this is a direct fulfillment of what was prophesied, then you either gotta buy into it or you don't think any of it's right. And so we get down to verse number 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment, with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. This person called Wonderful, Counselor, Prince of Peace, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace is going to come, and he's going to establish a government that's going to get its roots where? Just look at the verse. Where's this going to get its roots? Who said that? Who said that? David. Going to get its roots in the kingdom of David. Now, where does that come from? Okay. It goes back to God's promise to King David. And where is that promise? 2 Samuel chapter 7, around verse 14, where God says he's going to establish David's kingdom forever. Now, as we go through the rest of these prophets, we're going to see, and particularly we get to Zechariah, and we'll look at this more in detail when we get there, is that what happened? What happened to the physical lineage of David after Zedekiah? It ended with Zedekiah. In fact, there's a prophecy that says there will never be another king sit on the throne physically in Jerusalem after Zedekiah. None of it.
Zechariah would be childless.
Zechariah is going to be child. And so if Jesus doesn't, if you don't buy into the fact that Jesus came and is sitting on that spiritual throne today, then none of us sitting in this room today have a right to be in the kingdom. Jesus came and is sitting on the throne of David in a what kind of way? A spiritual way. And he established a kingdom. We see it right here in Isaiah 9. We see it in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. He establishes a kingdom that's going to last forever. Now, what does that kingdom look like in 2023? It's the church. We see that in the book of Galatians. Spiritual Israel, physical Israel becomes spiritual Israel. God's chosen people in the Old Testament, God's chosen people in the New Testament. The church is spiritual Israel today. The way to be part of God's people, the way to be in spiritual Israel is to be in Jesus Christ. That's a whole argument in Galatians. But without Jesus sitting on his throne today, none of us have a right to be part of God's people. That's what the Old Testament tells us. But people fail to see that because they want to make it a physical kingdom. Now, let me ask you, if the kingdom in 2023 is the church, what is the kingdom after Judgment Day? Can you give me a different word? The redeemed where? In heaven. The only way to get into heaven is to be in the church, is to be part of God's people. And so here in Isaiah probably didn't get this. The disciples certainly didn't get it. But here we see that he's going to have a kingdom that is going to last forever. Now I want to jump back to verse number 6. The last part of verse number 6. The Prince of Peace. Anybody got any idea what that word peace is? Everybody in here knows this word. Shalom. Shalom. Turn to John chapter 14. This was a theme verse for us a couple years ago. Must have been before that one. Before that banner. It may have been 2021. John 14:27. This is at the end, we read the first 6 verses of John 14, but oftentimes we don't get to the bottom of it. But look at what Jesus says. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you. Unto you. Neither let it be afraid. That idea of shalom. What does shalom mean? Come on, you Hebrew scholars. Okay, peace of God. What else is it? When a Hebrew or Jew says shalom, when do they say that? Okay, it means hello. It also means goodbye. But when they're talking about what kind of peace, Jesus says, I'm going to give you a peace. Let me ask you. Is there a sense where nobody in here, a sense that nobody in here has peace? Thank you, Jim, for at least shaking your head. Everybody else is sort of sitting there afraid to commit. Jim committed a little bit. Okay, Mike says, I'm trying to figure out with your choice of words what you're asking. What kind of stupid question is that, teacher? Go ahead, Jim. Okay, don't back off of your yes.
I know, but I don't think you have totalitarian. There's always something that's causing you not to be at peace. I mean, you may be peaceful in your family life, you may be peaceful there, but maybe there's something going on at work that you're not at peace with what's going on. So that aspect of your life, you're not at peace.
Okay.
For the rest of your being, you could be at peace in all those other areas, but there's certain areas that you may not be.
Okay, good. CJ?
think you may not have a worldly peace because the world can be so destructive and hard, but you can have a godly peace where you can peace that surpasses all understanding, and you know that when it's all said and done, if you just stay faithful, you can be peaceful about where you're going to end up.
That word shalom, when it talks about peace, it's not talking about a peace without trouble. Because as long as we're in on this side of Judgment Day, we're going to experience trouble in our lives. Jesus said that. Peter said that. Paul said that. We're never promised a perfectly calm Sea of Galilee. There's going to be storms in our lives that cause us trouble, but this idea of shalom is the idea, and Mike referred to earlier Psalm 23.